to learn Create Sew. In this lesson, let's talk about how to sew a seam. First, you should make sure that your machine is properly threaded. If you need help on how to thread your machine, I have some links below to how to thread Brother sewing machines. You can also search for your particular make and model and find videos for how to thread. When you're ready to sew your seam, take 2 pieces of fabric. Your fabric has a right side and a wrong side. The right side of your fabric usually has more vibrant color. The wrong side is more pale. To sew your seam, place your fabric right sides together. This means that the pretty side of the fabric is touching, and you'll be looking at the wrong side. Along one of the edges, we're going to sew our seam. When you sew, you have to leave what's called a seam allowance. The seam allowance is the space from the edge of the fabric to your stitches. You have to have a seam allowance so that your stitches don't fall off, otherwise you could end up with a hole. For most standard store-bought patterns, we use a 5/8 inch seam allowance. This means we're going to be sewing 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. The first thing you want to do when you begin sewing is make sure that you've selected the correct stitch. On this machine, so that we can use the guides on our needle plate, we want to make sure that we've selected stitch 00. This is the default straight stitch for this machine. So you can see that my stitch is at 00, and I have it set to a stitch length of 2.5. 2.5 is the default stitch length. It's what we use for most fabrics, such as cottons and flannels. If you're using a fabric that's really thick, such as fleece or felt, a stitch length that's bigger, such as 3.5, might be better. This dial on your machine controls the tension. If when you sew your stitches look funny, they look either too loose or too tight, you may have a problem with your tension. You can adjust this dial to help improve the look of your stitches. Most of the time, setting your tension at 4 is just perfect. If you do need to adjust your tension, make sure you rethread your machine every time you do. And make sure that your presser foot is up when you rethread. Before you begin sewing, if your machine has speed control, make sure that you adjust it to the speed that you're most comfortable with. Also, make sure you identify your back stitch button. This here is the back stitch button on my machine. When I hold that down, my machine will stitch backwards, which is necessary to create a knot. My machine's now threaded. I have my bobbin in and I'm ready to sew. I have my needle at the default position so that I can use my guides. I'm going to be making a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is right here. So I'm going to guide the edge of my fabric towards that mark. I'm going to lift up my presser foot and set the fabric underneath. I'm going to line up the edge of the fabric with my mark. Here's the back edge of my fabric. I want the needle to come down about 1/4 inch in front of it. If you have that purple thing tool, this flat end is 1/4 of an inch, so you can use that to gauge if you're a good distance away. I'm going to hold the thread tails at the back of my machine and I'm going to place the needle down. And I'm going to hold my back stitch button and I'm going to go back just a few stitches. That will create a knot so that my seam doesn't come undone. Now I'm going to stitch forward. So let go of your back stitch button and let's stitch forward. Remember, align the edge of your fabric towards your mark, so point it towards your guide. Slow down as you approach the end. Stop about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. Hold down your back stitch button and go back 2 or 3 stitches. You can also go forward again if you want it to be really secure. Lift your needle up Lift your presser foot up and slide your fabric out. Right here on the edge of my machine, I have a thread cutter. It's a good habit to trim your threads after you sew each seam. Now when we open up our fabric, it's sewn together nice and strong, and the raw edges are hidden on the back. Don't forget to backstitch every time you sew a seam unless you're instructed not to. A backstitch is like a knot. Without it, your seam will come undone. Happy sewing! I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial.